Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins, and I have with me today War Hamster, or Brady. Welcome, Brady.
Thanks for having me.
We are very, very excited to bring you what we envision on being a series for the next few weeks on Thursday of, again, the next few weeks about the Bank of Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, or the nickname
The Bank of Crooks and Criminals.
Crooks and Criminals. Corruption and crime. You could kind of come up with a whole bunch of different scenarios, but go ahead and bring up your Time magazine cover, because I think it pretty much says it in a nutshell. And we'll bring that on the screen because I think it's going to set the pace. And I did, while he's bringing that up, I want to mention the book that I got quite a few of my notes. Obviously, BCCI comes up in much of Operation Gladio, and I'll explain why in a second. But the Outlaw Bank, A Wild Ride into the Secret Heart of BCCI by Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwen. They were time writers. And here is one of their covers. This is the world's sleaziest bank. And I could not agree more. And it is apropos if you look at the paramilitary guy standing out in front, because it could easily have been called the Operation Gladio Bank. Because if you recall, the concept of Operation Gladio is the wagon wheel with the drug smuggling, human smuggling, and weapon smuggling. And in many cases, BCCI, from the time that it was created in 1972 until the time that it was basically disassembled and moved back into Pakistan, because it is still an existing bank today, but only in Pakistan. It is no longer an international bank. I don't know that you could conclude that it is not still in the corruption business, but it is not an international entity any longer. And a lot of that is how we're going to start the series off, and talking about the prosecution of this bank. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the history and the people involved and some of that. So I wanted to let you know that whenever you have cash-driven industry, which is drugs, weapons, and prostitution / human trafficking, slavery, modern-day slavery, you have to have a banking system, and you have to basically own that banking system in order to ensure that they don't generate SARS reports and all of those other types of mechanisms that kind of throw up all the red flags. And BCCI, along with other ones that we've talked about, Nugent Hand and the Vatican Bank, were all used to facilitate that type of industry. Do you have anything else you wanted to add with that?
Well, I like the subtitle of the Time magazine article, and it basically describes everything you just said in one paragraph. It says, exclusive, how the BCCI became a one-stop shopping center for criminals and spies, and how the U.S. is trying to cover up its involvement. And I think that just sums up that's our syllabus for today.
Correct. And I do think it's very interesting. Kind of my big, and I like doing the bottom line up front. My big takeaway from this is apparently all of the dictators that we've been identifying that were installed by the CIA, one of the requirements for accepting the dictatorship and being installed was creating a bank account at BCCI. You know, Noriega, Saddam Hussein, all of these people, they all banked at BCCI. And isn't that really
one of the big ones was Marcos of the Philippines?
Correct.
I mean, that's basically
makes it very convenient when you're money laundering.
It does, and BCCI ties into so many other stories we've talked about. I mean, everything from Operation Gladio, Iran Contra, It shows up everywhere for about a 15-year period.
Okay. So I want to introduce to you some people. We have, as I mentioned, the authors of this book were Time magazine writers, Beatty and Gwen. And they had a man come talk to them whose last name was Blum, B-L-U-M. He was a lawyer working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, investigating for John Kerry's committee into basically drug trafficking, money laundering, and etc. And those types of investigations take a lot of effort. He also served as the counsel to Frank Church's commission when it was going on, which obviously exposed a bunch of the CIA misdeeds. So this isn't just a nobody. He also was involved in exposing Lockheed's bribery scandals in paying off the Japanese officials for buying Lockheed. And his investigation led to the jailing of Tanaka, who was the prime minister of Japan. He also did an investigation for the Senate that led to the abdication of the Queen of Netherlands. He was involved in the investigation into ITT's involvement in the Chilean coup. So this is somebody of significance in understanding how Operation Gladio worked, because I just described to you at least two of their operations in his resume. And it also is interesting to note that his investigations and the Kerry Commission led to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Law. And during these hearings, CIA Director Richard Helms was required to testify in closed session, in which he lied and was later indicted for perjury. So this, at the time, was a big, big deal.
So I find a bit of irony to the fact that the reporters who really led the public investigation of this worked for Time magazine. The irony is the person who founded Time magazine was Harry Lutz, who was a alumni of Skull and Bones. And we're going to bring up Skull and Bones again later today. And I just sort of want to lay the table. We need to do at least one or two shows just on Skull and Bones. And I'm ready for that whenever you are. But it's that there's a little irony to have a Skull and Bones alumni be involved from the investigative side on this.
So what I have noticed in this book is, it, to some degree, not as much as others that I've read, which is why I'm using it, there is still some limited hangout there. And that, to me, is what you really have to know the subject before you can read these books, so that you can see where the limited hangout is. They are very careful in exposing BCCI to not incriminate the CIA.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean that's what their main article from that Time magazine was, how they slow walked it, how they covered it up, and yes, that's what Jack Blum was telling these Time reporters.
Yes, well, but I'm even talking about the Times reporters. They wrote this book. In this book, they are very hesitant to lay at the foot of the CIA their dastardly deeds. Not that they don't mention it, but it's very well finessed, so that if you are not aware of Operation Gladio, you are not going to be able to ferret that out of the information that they provide in this book.
The breadcrumbs are definitely there. I mean, they'll talk about Khashoggi, and he was an arms dealer who worked directly with the CIA, and the money was transacted through BCCI.
Correct.
So you have a direct connection.
Correct. I just find it interesting the way that they parse the words in here. And most importantly, I think, the Washington Post used BCCI because they were at the Washington, D.C. bank owned by BCCI, their bank account. So they were actually using BCCI as a banking conduit. The Washington Post was.
Which is not surprising because the bank that BCCI would go on to purchase First American Bank shares illegally, they're not allowed, foreigners were not allowed to own American banks, was the biggest bank in the DC metro area. So it's not a shock that connection happened.
And most of the Congress people had bank accounts there. So a lot of people alleged that one of the reasons why it was targeted is because it gave them access for blackmailing purposes to congressional bank accounts. So they could see and monitor where they were spending their money. Okay. So Bloom gets picked up in 1986 to 87, or excuse me, 86 to 88 to be an investigator on John Kerry's committee for drugs, Contra, and money laundering. That was basically the agenda that it was set. And when Bloom first meets with Beatty out in California to talk about the BCCI, he mentions his knowledge that he gained from the Kerry Commission. He also mentions that he only refers to him as Blanton, who was a Panama diplomat that worked for General Noriega and was an aide to Noriega, also served as his general counsel, had testified in a closed session of Congress about BCCI's role and the fact that Noriega had his bank account for his quote unquote CIA drug networking payouts at BCCI. So that was all captured according to Bloom in the Kerry Commission. And this all led to the revealing that BCCI had a branch in Miami, and it ends up getting busted for money laundering, drug trafficking, etc. in Tampa. And I assume you want to say a few things about that. You want to tell them about how they got busted?
Yeah, I just want to take a step back a little bit. I don't think we did I don't think we really explained the origins of BCCI, and we can do that in about a minute and take it to there. This is founded in 1972 by a Pakistani. I've got his name right here. It's one of those names that's hard to remember. Aga Hassan Abedi. And it's founded in 1972. It was supposed to be a Muslim world bank, but it's incorporated in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. Its main home of banking was in London, and we're going to come back to London here in a second because it's got a big connection. They ended up having an interest in 3 U.S. banks, which they were not allowed to do. They were laundering money for, as you say, drug lords, dictators, you name it, intelligence agencies, criminal underworld, human traffickers, drug traffickers. That was their business. And obviously they got involved in Florida. So let me pass the baton to you. I think you probably know, since you were there, you probably know the Florida story a little bit better than I do. I just know they were raided in 1990 and got a small fine, but I'm going to jump ahead of you. So,
okay. So the Florida angle is very interesting because how they got, so there was a big investigation going on with the customs and the IRS, and there were many different elements to the investigation. So they're having I'm trying to get all of it together. The agents that were doing the investigation were down in the Miami area, and they fake a wedding among the 2 agents that are pretending to be money launderer, drug trafficker, that whole thing. So they're all undercover, and they fake a wedding, and they're going to get married up in Tampa, which, for those of you who don't know, Tampa was a big mafia. They were like the number 2 site for the Pakistani group. That all happened out of Tampa.
Yeah, that's where Meyer Lansky was living for about 25 years.
Yeah, so Tampa is only number 2 to Miami when it comes to this type of activity. So they fake a wedding up in Tampa, and during the bachelor party, the day before the wedding is going to happen, they're all busted. So one of the actual guy that was the bachelor that was getting married, of course, is one of the investigators, and so was the female, the bride to be. And so they end up during the bachelor party arresting all of the BCCI employees, and they actually even got some of the drug traffickers on that bus. So it wasn't just about the BCCI, but not a lot happens because William Von Raab, RAAB, he was the customs chief during this whole operation. And he said of all of the time that he had spent in the customs office, that it was the most important money laundering bust that had ever occurred in the entire United States history. But that DOJ allowed minor plea bargainings and slaps on the wrist as far as both he and Bloom was concerned, and that both of them said that they believed that it was fixed. And this is a quote from him: BCCI is a global criminal empire. That's from the customs officer in charge of the investigation.
I found a fun quote from Von Raab where he basically confirmed that it was Gates, who would become the head of the CIA 2 years later, Robert Gates. He's the one who called it the Bank of Crooks and Criminals.
Yes, that's true.
So yeah, Von Raab's an interesting character. He knew all the players. He was definitely neck deep in the whole thing,
and very disgruntled as a result of, as was Bloom. So Bloom obviously wanted BCCI investigated under the Kerry Commission, and basically towards the tail end, after all of this happens and they get their little fish, not only is BCCI still allowed to operate in the state of Florida, even though Florida tried to get them.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Remember to turn off the ringer during shows.
One of the questions I had for you, Brady, is this, because this is going to be relevant as we go on through this. One of the other parties that is protected extensively in this book by the Time writers is the Fed. I want your personal opinion, professional opinion, having been a Wall Street banker. Is there any way that all of this happened and the Fed not know about it?
No, it's a yes and no question. And the timing of when this happens is interesting. BCCI is founded in 1972. That's about the exact same time period that Nixon takes us off the gold standard. We'd had the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which basically took the world's reserve currency from the British pound to the U.S. dollar. And what it basically meant is all currencies could be converted into dollars, and the dollar had a fixed rate of exchange with gold at $35 an ounce. What had happened in the late 60s, early 70s, some countries, specifically France, started saying, we want to redeem our dollars for gold. And as the story goes, it turns out we might not have had all that gold. Nixon arbitrarily takes us off the gold standard, and currencies start to free float. What that creates is the golden age of what's known as the City of London. That's the banking sector in London, where even today they recognize they welcome all the Russian oligarch money, et cetera. That's what they've done. It's the bank and mafia connections go back decades and decades. But they didn't have, the reason they were doing business in dollars in London is the Federal Reserve would not have a jurisdiction because it was outside the U.S. shores. And the British regulators would not have regulation because it was being traded in U.S. dollars. That's why BCCI set up, most of their banking went through London, just because of that background scenario. So there was a little bit of opaqueness to what they were doing because of the City of London. That being said, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury regulates every single bank in America. And we've already talked about how BCCI illegally owned more than 3 banks: the Independence Bank of Encino, California, the National Bank of Georgia, and of course the First American Bank shares in DC. So yeah, the answer is yes. They knew what was going on. Were they dissuaded from investigating? I think is probably the more important question. The answer is apparently yes.
Okay. Yeah, because that becomes very clear. This book is an apology tour for the Fed not acting earlier. And that is one of the things that comes out very clear, which is why I think in many cases, while they give you a lot of detail and facts, it is a very limited hangout, both for the CIA and the Fed, which is expected when you're dealing with time for the reasons you already pointed out.
Yeah. Well, and okay, so should we talk about the John Kerry connection?
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
And let's go through just a little bit more of the setting up of Bloom. So Bloom starts asking all of these questions, and he finds out that they're in New York while he's on the commission. He's finding out they're in New York. They had shares bought in banks in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, Houston. As you said, they owned a bank in Florida, and there were other shares bought in banks, not only just the one in Miami, which was Centrust, but Tampa and Boca Raton as well. So they're definitely branching out. So Bloom's is getting very concerned at this point. And he gets a call from an executive at BCCI who had left the bank and Bloom is still on the Senate investigative staff when he gets this phone call. So he had basically taken all of the transcripts and subpoenaed documents and files down to talk to this banker who was talking, that wanted to talk to him and basically spill his guts. So BCCI in Miami was their branch for all of the activities in South America. So that's what this guy, who was the BCCI banker. And in all of the documents that I find, he's referred to as Witness A. And Witness A says that the bank had set up all types of illicit transactions, both money laundering for drugs, weapons, human trafficking, everything. And that there are over 3,000, that number is stunning, 3,000 high net worth criminal entities banking at BCCI. 3,000.
And it's interesting that the reason they picked Florida as a kind of a hotshot spot. It's twofold, I think. First of all, it's coming at the tail end of the 80s, where the cocaine cowboys coming out of South America. That was the trafficking center. But it was also a big center for the savings and we just had deregulation and savings and loans. The S&L business had totally changed the deregulation changed the ownership structures for a bank. You used to have 300 or 400 common stockholders in a bank, and they moved it to one, and they stopped really scrutinizing who that would be. And S&L's really specialized in giving real estate loans, mortgage loans to middle America. This is really a perfect setup for money laundering. You bring in dirty money into a bank, you lend it to buy real estate, and then sell it later, comes out the other end clean. Interestingly enough, the National Association of Realtors, the NAR, has been lobbying for decades to ensure that they do not have any kind of know your customer or anti-money laundering rules for real estate transactions. If you're selling stocks and bonds, you've got to know your customer, and you've got to do all kinds of AML forms for foreign money. That is not the case in real estate. They've had an exemption by our government for, I think, 4 decades now.
And of course, that's their number one place to money launder. And so what's interesting about that in my research of Operation Gladio is all of the oil guys that were behind the JFK assassination, they're involved in so much of Operation Gladio and the intrigue in the Middle East, blah, blah, blah. What you find is the savings and loan fiasco, the melting down of that industry, they almost served like the predicate for BCCI, because what I have read as it relates to the money laundering aspect of Operation Gladio is that these savings and loans were used, so they were issuing large amounts of uncollateralized loans to themselves. And I'm just going to make this up. If you had a savings and loan in Arkansas, and this actually happened, there was a savings, but I'm not going to use the right numbers. There was a savings and loan in Arkansas, one in Dallas and one in Houston. If you took all of the board of directors, they basically were a group of about 30 people, all in the oil industry. And they just like divided up 10, 10, and 10. And then these 10 through, and the guy that was the president of this bank was one of the guys on this bank. And the guy that was the president of this bank was on the board of directors of this bank. So they shared these 30 people, and not only in the top management of the banks, but also on the board of directors. And then what they did was they loaned out like 10 million at a time in real estate loans to each other. And they were all uncollateralized. And as a result,
it's going a little deeper in that. This brings in one of my favorite characters of this period. Is called Walter Mischer. And he's a big land developer out of Texas. He owns Allied Bank. It's the third largest bank in Houston. All kinds of connections to organized crime. He's one of the political power brokers of Texas, the big oil. He's really close to LBJ. Well, his kids actually went to school with the Bush children. He was also close with Carlos Marcello, who's the New Orleans mafia boss. And of course, we know how New Orleans fits into this story. Where it gets fun, a couple of fun things out of there. Neil Bush, the Bush kid they don't talk too much about, he was partners in this by a guy by the name of Stephen Halper.
oh,
And
man.
his father, whose father was Ray Klein, or father-in-law, who was one of the CIA's founding members. Halper was also the last entry in Oliver North's White House diaries. Stephen Halper, and if the name Stephen Halper sounds familiar, of course, he was at the very heart of the Trump-Russia, Russiagate. Another fun little connection with Neil Bush. He was friends with the family of John Hinckley Jr., who's the guy who shot President Reagan.
Correct.
And, if there's no connection there, okay. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to all these connections, but
and that's the fascinating part of this. When you start doing this research, you pick up this rock and there's like 30 worms under it. And so I wanted to explain that, since we brought up the savings and loan. It is as if that BCCI was yet another, because that's exactly what you find they were doing in all of these multiple banks. Theirs is a little bit more intricate, but they were issuing uncollateralized loans. And in the case of the savings and loans, what would happen is that once they issued out all of this money and they folded or collapsed, whatever, they all had their money and they didn't have to pay it back because there was no collateral associated with the money. So it is just like a large theft of wealth going on here. And the people that got taken to the cleaners were the normal mom and pop middle-class America that had just so happened to have picked that bank to bank at, because their money was gone and it was in the hands of multimillionaires. And so
billions of dollars was disappeared during that scandal. That's one of the very first videos I ever did, was talking about the Bush and Clinton crime families and their whole connection to the savings and loans. So that's near and dear to my heart. And you mentioned the no collateral loans, because BCCI, this came out in the testimony, they would have a credit committee that made secret loan approvals. And there's no criteria, show me your W-2s and your 1099s. They didn't do that. And who are they lending money to? Oh, themselves. One of the big investors in BCCI was a Middle East royal family relative. He's a big shareholder. And he got what was called a non-performing loan. And when we say non-performing, it means they were never making any payments. Just give them the money and never collect. And that was happening on an international scale by BCCI, but on a domestic American with the SNLs. And yeah, they're connected as all heck.
Okay. So Then we get back, we have the Colombian Bank that, which is a branch of BCCI, was set up for drug and money laundering. You also had one in Panama, and in walks a guy by the name, from Bloom's perspective, a guy by the name of Amjad Awan. Now, what I have not done, and I have tried, I have done a lot of research into the Awan brothers that came here as part of the
First thing that popped into my head when you said Awan.
Yeah. So Amjad Awan is another witness that worked with Bloom to expose, but he worked for BCCI, and I would bet, because he's from Pakistan, and I would bet that somehow he's related to the Awan brothers, but I haven't found that thread yet. So all of you researchers out there, you're more than welcome to go look for that.
And we're talking about the Awan brothers who worked for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Debbie Wasserman. And what state is she from again?
Florida.
Oh, go figure. Yeah, that's
and this guy was living in Miami, where her district is.
Yeah, when the government seized the Awan brothers' laptop, but we've never seen the contents of that. And they have managed to somehow, they're living back in Pakistan, as far as I understand.
Pakistan, isn't that where BCCI is from?
I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
I'm sure. Okay, so he was Noriega's personal banker in Miami, by the way. Awan was. So you've got Bloom, who asked Kerry Commission for subpoena power over the 4 banks. And that kept getting put off and put off. And so Awan was targeted in Tampa for the money laundering case, which the one we were just talking about that they busted. That operation was called C-Chase. So Awan tells Bloom that BCCI secretly owns First American Bank. He was the first one that tipped Bloom off to the fact that BCCI owned First American Bank in Washington, D.C. And basically at the time, First American Bank was an $11 billion bank. Bloom gets a sworn statement from Awan in October 1988. Now, this is important for a lot of different reasons. 1988 is the month before the election in 88, right? And what was that election? That was Reagan going out and George H.W. Bush coming in, right?
Got it.
So DOJ arrests Awan and pulls the plug on basically looking into this. And he doesn't have a trial until 15 months later. BCCI will not comply with any of the subpoenas that the Senate issues as part of Bloom's investigation. And in walks BCCI lawyers, Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. They appear as the attorneys for BCCI. Now, I know you're going to want to say something about them. And it also turns out that they were functioning as the U.S. branch in Washington, D.C.'s president. So they're the lawyer and the president for the bank that was criminally bought.
Yeah, well, the question we probably need to tell everyone is, who was Clark Clifford? He's not a household name, but he should be, because he used to be the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America.
So let me just get this straight. Mike Benz just did a blockbuster show the other day where he showed that Rumsfeld was the drug guy at Gilead who becomes the Secretary of Defense. Now we have another money launderer that becomes the Secretary of Defense. So it makes you wonder what's going on at the Secretary of Defense's office. But do you have some other things you want to say about Clark Clifford other than
no? That's just a snapshot. I mean, it's just, you mentioned Mike Benz. He's just a fantastic source of information. He's got to be the best researcher going. He talks about the blob, which is the Pentagon, the CIA, and the State Department all working together to to what you call Operation Gladio type operations all over the world to topple foreign governments. That's our foreign policy. And who's it dictated by? Multinational corporate interests, and quite often the underworld. And we know the connection to the mafia and various mafias around the world to intelligence agencies goes back to World War II and Operation Underworld. So all those connections. And you're going to see the same people from the same cliques and the same clubs to go in and out of government and private sector back and forth from, be the CEO or chairman of a company. Then they go back into government service. And they're the same people always that are rotating in and out of the State Department. And, it doesn't matter if you've got a Republican or a Democrat president, with very few exceptions since World War II, our foreign policy and these shenanigans that we pull on other countries, they don't change depending on right versus left, Republican versus Democrat.
No, two wings of the same bird. So let's just give people a little bit of meat here so that they can understand the connections here. Clark Clifford worked in the Truman administration, the JFK administration, the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, and the Jimmy Carter administration. He was one of the most well-placed Democrat Party bosses that has ever been created. And as you said, he is not a household name, and he should be. He definitely is in Democrat circles. He was like the guy to come bend the knee to back in the day. So he held the White House counsel job from 1946 to 1950. That was during the Truman administration. And what's key for us in my research is that was the very creation of Operation Gladio. That is when all of the units and the agreements and all of that stuff was being signed with NATO in creating, and he would have been privy to all of the communications that occurred at the Truman level, and Truman definitely knew all about it.
Yeah, he would have helped. He would have helped author the National Security Act of 1947, which basically gave us the CIA.
So, correct. He was also the chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board from 1963 to 68. So that he served in Johnson's administration as the chairman, the head guy of the intelligence. And that guy sits on the NSC staff when they're doing all of their special actions as it related to covert actions. And this would have been during the time where they're overthrowing the Indonesian head of state and doing all of the coups in the aftermath of the Lumumba assassination throughout the rest of Africa. They were busy in preparing what would become the Angola mess later on. All of this stuff would have been under his purview and in his job jar as the Intelligence Advisory Board chairman. And then in the immediate aftermath of him serving as that in 1968, he moves over for 1 year as the Secretary of Defense until 1969. So he is at the heart of Operation Gladio, the setting up of the drug networks, the setting up of the weapons networks, the weapons network that was going on during the Vietnam and the skimming off of the top of those. All of that stuff would have been going on while he's in the White House. That's why he's critical to the setting up in 1972 of the BCCI.
The connections are fascinating. And you look, it shows the different power cartels that we have in this country that run internationally. You've got the military industrial complex, which Clifford probably comes from. You've got the oil tycoons, which basically out of Houston, which would be the Bush family connections. You have the Wall Street, cartel, the banking cartel. Of course you're gonna have, but we have various other ones. We have the drug cartels, and we've got the big agro and all that. But you can just see them all working together and placing their people in these, I guess, musical chair positions of power, going from one place to another. And you can almost use Wikipedia. Just look at these people's bios. And if you have the Gladio background knowledge, and just say, okay, I see where this is going. And really points to it. Okay. I left out a fun little tidbit on our friend. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the name. I was just talking about him.
Clark
connection.
Clifford?
Yeah, no, I was talking to the guy I was talking about before, Misher. Walter Misher also had bought a bunch of real estate in Honduras to buy Honduran paper mills, allegedly. He ended up selling them to Clint Mickelson Jr., who would sell them to the CIA. And that was the United Fruit and Dulles coup in Guatemala. So that's all documented that happened. And he, of course, he bought a bunch of land where all the drug planes were landing during Iran-Contra. So that's our guy Misher. So it's a connection from the oil side.
Oh, I remember that guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't get it. I had his name pronounced something else in my head just because of the way it's spelled. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that guy.
The guys he was connected to, just to show you some of the power brokers involved, Lloyd Benson, who was the power broker in Democratic politics for 2 decades, a guy by the name of Orrin Hatch, the saintly senator from Utah that everyone loved, and of course, former Secretary of State James Baker is involved in that as well, among others.
That's crazy. And of course, James Baker makes an appearance in the Carlyle fiasco with the Carlyle Group and the Bushes and all of those.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to give a couple of words on Robert Altman. So Robert Altman is basically Clark Clifford's protege. So he basically gets a job working for Clark Clifford in the immediate aftermath of the him, graduating from law school and stuff. So he's kind of scarfed up right away. He also had a partner, Christopher Weaver, that was involved in media, like all CIA assets are. And they were in the business of creating video games, which I found completely crazy since, that I believe that whole industry is like music industry and used as a propaganda tool.
Exactly where I was going with it. Probably brainwashing as well.
Okay. So he also was a television producer and had other, interests in doing stuff like that. So he becomes a partner in the law firm of Clark Clifford and basically becomes his assistant. And everywhere that you see Clark Clifford in the BCCI story, Robert Altman is right behind him and definitely has all the credentials that you would think of a CIA asset himself. Okay. So in walks, now we're still talking about Bloom, and in walks another witness, and we're going to refer to him as Witness B. If you do any research into BCCI, in some documents, they made up a nickname for him, and his nickname was Ali Mirza, Mirza, but that is a nickname. That is not his real name, because the information he begins to provide to this whole Kerry Commission and all of the research that was being done at the time into BCCI, in so many meetings between Beatty and Gwynn and Bloom, everybody's looking at each other. And we'll get to Morgenthau a little bit more with his investigator, Moscow, in a minute. But everybody in every meeting that talks about this guy's looking at each other going, they're going to kill him. They're going to kill him because of the information that he begins to provide. So Witness B tells that BCCI had shut down the Kerry Commission, that they were solely responsible, they being basically the CIA behind the BCCI, for shutting down the Kerry Commission, and that they also was responsible for the DOJ not furthering the investigation after the Tampa, Florida bust. And when I went back, and then of course, as soon as I see something like this, and I just say this for other junior researchers out there, as soon as I hear that, I want to know immediately who was in charge of the Senate. Because if you're going to shut down a Senate commission, you have to go to the top, right? So you go to the top, you find George H.W. Bush as the Senate leader because he was the sitting VP at the time. You also find the number 2 guy, Strom Thurmond. Now, I don't know if you guys know anything about Strom Thurmond, but let me just tell you just a tad about Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond, another well-placed South Carolina Republican, like we know that we have today, that's compromised. Also, for my audience, remember William Pauley? Strom Thurmond is from the exact same area where William Pauley was from. And William Pauley is a huge guy in Operation Gladio.
Flying Tigers, right?
He founded he funded, and is a better word to say, he had the Curtiss aircraft franchise in Southeast Asia. So he produced all of the aircraft over there to equip not only the Flying Tigers, but he produced all of the Chiang Kai-shek aircraft that ends up being the Taiwanese Air Force. He is singly responsible for their shipping industry and getting that all set up for them. And we know that that was used for drugs, to and fro. He also used his personal yacht for an invasion of Cuba in one of the assassination attempts on Castro.
I have that in my notes too. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, this ties in the Green Gang, which was the biggest organized crime in China, who were the world's biggest opium dealers until Mao Zedong kicked them out. They would end up going to, some of them would go to Taiwan, but a lot of them in the opium business all went to the Golden Triangle, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Afghanistan. And where has the CIA been neck deep in operations for since the 1960s?
The Golden Triangle.
Yep.
And so you had William Pauley owned sugar plantations on Cuba. He owned the airline in Cuba, and he owned all of the busing transportation in Cuba, which tells you that he was knee deep in every mafia operation inside of Cuba when Batista was president. So he had a vested interest in getting Castro out of there.
So you keep mentioning that the investigation was stonewalled, and the best example of that I can give you is, we've spent the last 45 minutes talking about all these connections and all these big amounts of money that are going through BCCI and subsidiaries. The total fine levied on BCCI in that whole investigation was $15 million. That's it. And just local bankers in Florida went to jail. Nobody else. It stopped there. It was completely cordoned off from going any higher.
So I did want to add that there was so much to blackmail Strom Thurmond about. Strom Thurmond was one of the, and that's what this is all really about. Who knows this stuff about people that comes out much later? Strom Thurmond was one of the biggest racists ever to sit in the Senate. And he was against the Civil Rights Act. He was against the Voting Rights Act. But did you know that he had an illegitimate black child?
I don't think I had that, no.
He had, at 22, had sex with a 15-year-old daughter of a house servant of his parents. She had a child, and it did not come out that she was his child until 2003 when he died. He paid for her college. It wasn't even contested that he was the father of the child. And I just point that out because I want people to understand these are the types of people that are in positions of power over you. They have no ethics and no morals, and because of that, they have potential for being blackmailed out the yin yang. And yet this guy could have had that type of an issue used to blackmail him because he was responsible for shutting down Kerry's commission ultimately.
Well, it's interesting. The question is, was John Kerry actually trying to do a real investigation at the time? And I'm going to bring up a question mark on that. Do you want me to go into those connections now?
Well, let's go ahead with the rest of the leadership, and then we'll come back to that one.
Okay.
The majority leader was Bob Dole. And I know you have a story because I have a personal connection to Bob Dole. His wife was when I was deployed in 1991, which again is around this same time. His wife was in charge of the Red Cross at the time. I actually met her, slept in the same room with her when we were deployed to northern Iraq. And I have a picture of the room. I'm not sure that I have a picture of her and I together, but you have a comment about that.
Yeah, well, what do we know about the Red Cross? It's basically been all kinds of things. It's been an intelligence operation, and it's a way of going into foreign countries, enemy territory, pretending to be a non-government organization, but actually being another tool of the CIA and State Department. That goes back to World War I. And it's funny that you brought up the Red Cross, because the investigator out of New York, U.S. attorney, was a guy by the name of Robert Morgenthau. And he's got a fascinating history. He thinks the money laundering was much bigger than Tampa. He was right. He shared a bunch of info with the Federal Reserve Board, which you brought up earlier. And it was just shut down. They weren't interested in his information. He was actually trying to do a legitimate investigation. He's got an interesting background. His grandfather was a guy by the name of Henry Morgenthau, who was really good friends, a big donor to Woodrow Wilson, was the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during World War I, did a lot of work on the Armenian genocide, and he actually opposed the Jewish homeland in Israel, and he was an Ashkenazi Jew. But when he got out of serving with the government, he became the head of the American Red Cross. His son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was another really interesting guy. He was a U.S. Treasury Secretary for almost the entire term of FDR. He played a major role in designing and financing the New Deal. Social Security, which is going bankrupt, that's a Morgenthau plan. He had a big role of financing the U.S. in World War II. He's the one who put together the Lend-Lease program for Europe. He's the one who supported China. And they put something together called the Morgenthau Plan, which was a proposal to completely weaken Germany by removing all industrial capabilities after World War II, because they were worried about Germany rearming themselves and creating World War III. The Hoover investigation actually concluded the Morgenthau Plan wouldn't have worked, and over 25 million Germans would have starved to death. Just one more interesting side note. Convicted Soviet spy or suspected Soviet spy guy by the name of Harry Dexter was like his right-hand man and helped draft the Morgenthau Plan. But all kinds of interesting. One last connection. He married a woman called Eleanor Lehman, whose father was the founder of Lehman Brothers.
Whoa. What the heck?
Yeah, small world.
That's crazy. Okay. So, wow, that was a lot. That's mind-blowing, actually. That's crazy.
The connections never stop. I mean, it's like a spider web.
And so I just want to add one thing for the Red Cross thing, because probably some people's going to note this, especially ones that's followed me. Red Cross actually goes back a little bit before World War I, because that was talked about in Anthony Sutton's book about the Bolshevik Revolution.
Absolutely.
One of the missions that went to Russia in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 1900s was a Red Cross mission, except for there was only like 5 doctors out of 30 people. And the 5 doctors came back 30 days later. And the rest of the people are the ones that were part of the international syndicate that was mapping out Russia for railroads and General Electric to come in and electrify it. And all of that industrial expansion that all of the industrialists were paid for with the Tsar's gold was done under the guise of a Red Cross mission. So people need to understand that the Red Cross has not ever actually been about anything to do with medicine. It has been 100% a cutout for CIA operations. And before that, the international syndicate as it existed back then.
Yeah, it's probably the very first of those NGOs. And now we know that it's just anytime you see an NGO and look at their funding, they're getting all of it or most of it from USAID, which is basically the State Department's, that's the legal side of Operation Gladio, is the State Department funneling money to NGOs. What was interesting about the Red Cross and the Bolsheviks is we know there was American and British bankers who financed the Bolsheviks. Well, the British agents could go in there under, their real names, and because there was England had a treaty with Russia, they had an alliance. America did not, so we sent our agents in under the guise of the Red Cross. That was the first time, I think that was the very first time I heard about the Red Cross doing this kind of things, was reading that book. And they just keep popping up all over the place.
Yes, they do. So Bloom tells, and let me just one last thing to close that loop. I just think it's interesting that Dole would have been in the leadership of the Senate while his wife's in charge of the Red Cross /CIA, all at the time that BCCI is on the hot seat. Just hilarious. Okay. So Bloom tells witness B to call the Tampa Customs Office because he's going out of business. So his funding's been cut. They're closing the commission down. And witness B still, he wants to get so he puts him in touch with the customs office in Tampa, but he says he still wants to meet with Bloom. He trusts Bloom in the information. So Bloom flies down to Miami. But he contacts the custom guys and all of the good people that had been working really hard that were disappointed in what the Justice Department ended up doing with the small fine and I don't think any of the prison sentences were longer than a year of the group that they had busted in Tampa. It was just like the Nuremberg and everything else. It was all bullshit. So, but they got their bust and they went on about business. So the customs guys and the U.S. district attorneys that were disgusted with the DOJ's lack of evidence or lack of pursuit, they put together a team that goes and they get the room next door to the room that Bloom's going to meet with this guy in, and they wire the room up. So the entire thing's taped, and it's like 3 8-hour days worth of tapes that they get from this guy. And this guy just like blabs everything about BCCI, everything that he knows about the banking and the banking setup in South America, meetings that he had been to, blah, blah, blah. So he, in this tape, and they don't go into too much of it in the book, but he talked about all of the politicians in the United States that had been bought off. And he named names, and they're on the tapes. He identified who owned the DC Bank, who owned the Georgia Bank, the Independence Bank, Trust that was down in Miami. He told all about how they put the deal together. So Bloom brings back witness A to be taped in the same format. So now they've got the 3 days worth of tapes of witness B. So he calls in witness A to come into the same setup here that we've got set up in the hotel. And he gets him all on record. So Altman eventually gets to witness B. And witness B is telling him kind of a little white lie that he has been approached and asked questions. Altman instructs him to shred everything that he has and get the hell out of the United States. That was his lawyer's recommendation to a guy who's basically saying that he committed crimes. He's telling him to shred paper and get out. Which, by the way, if you look into Nugent Hand, that's exactly what they did too. As soon as they knew that people were on to them, they had like the Iran-Contra shredding party of Oliver North. And then, Nugent gets killed, but Hand gets the hell out of Dodge. He goes on the run. He probably had the same attorneys. And so they said to the regulators that there was no BCCI involvement. They deny everything. And this is when witness B ends up telling Bloom that Clifford is operating as basically the lawyer of First American Bank, as well as being the chairman of the board, and that Altman is the president of the DC Bank too. So Clifford tells the regulators, when he's asked, that some of the same investors were in BCCI and First American, but he swears, which is what gets him in trouble, that BCCI has no role in the management of any of the US. They just happen, as a matter of coincidence, to have overlapping board members.
Just a coincidence.
Yeah.
So we got all this evidence laid out. A rookie prosecutor can build a case on this, and yet it goes no further than Florida. And I bring back the question, John Kerry. He's running the Senate investigation. Well, first of all, the thing that you know about John Kerry is he's an alumni in 1966 of Skull and Bones. Well, where's the Department of Justice in all this? Turns out the guy leading that prosecution is a character we've heard of before by the name of Robert Mueller, who would become the head of the FBI 1 week before 9/11. And then he would lead the investigation into 9/11 and came up with results that are not quite as believable as they'd like us to think. Interesting connection between Kerry and Bob Mueller. Turns out that about an hour from where I'm sitting right here in Concord, New Hampshire, Bob Mueller and John Kerry were high school classmates and lacrosse teammates in high school. They've known each other since they were teenagers. One of them would rise to become a Democrat presidential candidate and now Secretary of State. And the other one would become the head of the FBI. So those are the kind of connections. They both knew that they were looking at the same thing. Information's getting stonewalled. And it's just a classic example of insiders failing upwards.
And Robert Mueller worked with James Baker, who you've already introduced, while he was the U.S. Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. So that's the position he had while all of this BCCI cases, or lack of cases, case was being set up. During that same tenure, don't you find it interesting that he was in charge of the prosecution of Manuel Noriega, who also was a BCCI customer that went a little rogue on them and wanted to set up his own side job of running drugs to compete with the CIA drug networks. And it was only then that he gets prosecuted by the United States under the guise of Robert Mueller. Oh, and one other connection. He was also in charge of the Pan Am Flight 103 crash investigation, which we have looked into and know that that was another setup for them to try to take out Gaddafi.
And one more Bob Mueller little point of interest is he was the guy who ran the prosecution against John Gotti, the family boss of the Gambino crime family. So,
and what did they deal with? Money laundering, drugs. Yeah. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you just can't make this stuff up.
The overlap is amazing, actually, in so many different ways. Okay. So let me get to my next note. So I had a question, and I'd like your honest opinion. Was Clark, Clifford, and Altman using BCCI, or was BCCI using them?
Yes. That's the answer, both. I think it's one hand washing the other. These, the public servants, they don't make that much money in government. They've got to move to the private sector to, be able to make up their millions. So I think Clark's reward for all of his service was being put as the head of the bank in DC. That's a reward. He may not have even known that much about banking, but that's, they put him on the board. He was the chairman. That's his reward for public service and keeping his mouth. Yeah.
And so let me also point out since we talked about this briefly in the savings and loan fiasco, that the quote unquote shareholders at BCCI weren't actually shareholders, because on the books, once we get to the audit part, which we will in probably an upcoming show, but the auditors, of course, are my favorite company, Price Waterhouse, because every bank, Nugent Hand, Castle Bank, Price Waterhouse is basically an intelligence services that go in and stamp, you're a fine bank. And even if the bank crashes the next day, Price Waterhouse can be counted on to not look at anything that's nefarious in any bank. So if your audit has been done by Price Waterhouse, it's not worth the paper it's written on. But having said that, it was later proven using an audit of Price Waterhouse, that a part that was not released publicly, that in every case, the shareholders that were on paper actually didn't put any money or invest anything into the bank at all. They were given a loan for the exact amount of money of shares that they bought, and then the shares were held by BCCI as collateral for the loans. Did you know that?
Partially. I understand the structure. It's fascinating that the bank was actually able to stay semi-solvent as long as it was. And the only thing I can guess is they were getting exorbitant fees on some of the services they were providing.
So let me tell you how they did it, because that came out too. That came out because what Betty had been allowed to do in the Middle East, one of them, and I'm sure you're right, they did charge, I think their fee was 15% on weapon sales that they quote unquote financed. And they didn't technically finance them. It was, for example, if Iran wanted the illegal missiles, like in the Iran-Contra arrangement, the Iranian government put funds on deposit at BCCI, and then those would be transferred because those weapons went through Israel. That money would be transferred and divided up along the way, because part of it, because they charged too much, part of it went into Ollie North's account in Switzerland, part of it went into Israel, because we snuck those missiles in through Israel into Iran. Israel was the weapons money or middleman for those missiles, as well as Aden Khashoggi that you pointed out, and another Iranian. So there was a lot of fingers in the pie, but so all of those transactions create what you guys call float. But they had even a bigger scam going. All of the Middle Eastern countries are in the middle of rapid growth in the 70s and 80s. So they have workers from every other foreign country, but millions of them out of Pakistan go to work in Abu Dhabi, go to work in Saudi, go to work in some of the other UAEs, Kuwait, all of those, right? So what happens when that occurs? We've saw it here with the Mexican migrant workers, even the legal ones, right? They all send remittance back. Well, that creates a float in the system. So they're paid in cash generally. And all of those millions of workers from Pakistan are going to use a Pakistani bank in these foreign countries to remit their money back to their families in Pakistan. And so Abedi was using that float, which happened to be billions of dollars every day, as his quote unquote capital.
It's fascinating. And again, we have this information now. They had it then, and it's not. Why was it not investigated? They didn't want to, and the people, and of course they're all going to hide behind national security. We can't tell you. This is classified. That's how they've been getting with their dirty tricks since 1947.
And they definitely use national security.
Yeah, it's just a big thing they can hide behind, and that's why we get redacted. You can FOIA all this information, and it's going to be 95% redacted, and they're going to always say, "Oh, but we blame it on national security. We can't tell you." and stuff never gets declassified, or it's, everyone's dead by the time it does. And the operatives, the government operatives that we talked about, like John Kerry and Bob Mueller, they get rewarded. They've shown that they can be trusted. They're willing to play the game, and that's how they fail upwards. And that's who runs our government. This is the technocratic state and the people on top of it.
So in the story, we get into Jimmy Carter coming into office, and his best buddy, who owns a bank called First American in Georgia, was the Jimmy Carter's OMB, the Office of Management and Budget Director. His name's Burt Lance. So Burt Lance owns the bank. The bank's not doing well, and he really wants to sell it. And what I found extremely fascinating is the connection of Jimmy Carter and BCCI.
Yeah, Carter would receive an $8 million campaign donation from them.
And flying around on their jet. Did you know they bought Air Force Two?
No, I did not.
They bought Air Force Two as a company jet and basically gave it to Carter to fly around the world. They also donated tens of millions of dollars to his version of the Clinton Foundation. Jimmy Carter had a very similar, if not identical, foundation set up that BCCI was money laundering money into for him to personally use while he's flying around on their jet all over the world.
That's it. It's interesting because I just read recently that when Carter came into office, the deep state, or whatever we want to call the cabal in military intelligence complex, the blob, they actually didn't like Carter. Carter's foreign policies were going to really restrict their activities.
And it did, because he tied foreign aid to human rights. And he's the one that cut off the Contras. He said that their murdering of people in Nicaragua did not warrant giving them foreign aid, and he cut them off. He fired, that was the Midnight Massacre at the CIA. He fired 1,000 CIA officers. He was not well liked at all. You almost see this as the blackmail setup of Carter, because this bank in Georgia that BCCI ends up with held the mortgage to Carter's family peanut business. So once they bought that bank, they had him buy the private parts, right?
It's fascinating stuff. It's not quite the image of Carter that the media has portrayed for the last 50 years. Just innocent, good old boy peanut farmer.
Yeah. And so, and he may have been. I do believe that the international syndicate, I mean, that's why he didn't get a second term. And that's why they helped Reagan do the October surprise and keeping the Iranian prisoners a little, or the hostages a little longer, and blah, blah, blah. They definitely wanted Carter out. But I do think that they exerted a tremendous amount of pressure on Carter. And I think once he figured out that he wasn't going to win, he took him for whatever he could. And that's what the foundation.
One of the things I mentioned earlier is that the shadow state, the shadow government, whatever your term is, the criminal syndicate. Yeah. That which controls U.S. foreign policy. They've had control of just about every president, whether Republican or Democrat, with a few exceptions. And the three exceptions I like to cite are, of course, JFK, and we know what happened to him. Then you had Jimmy Carter, and you just discussed why they didn't like him. But who he ran against when he won in '76 was Gerald Ford, and of course his VP was Nelson Rockefeller. Interesting thing about Gerald Ford is he sat on the Warren Commission that investigated Dulles' assassination. That was Ford. Of course, the third president we've had was a gentleman by the name of Donald J. Trump that these people didn't like. But that's three in a 62-year period, or 64 years. We've had three presidents that were not controlled or controllable by these assets.
Yeah. And people like to throw Nixon in there, but Nixon was definitely part of the group. I think he fell out of favor.
Yeah, and I think that I've always thought that was the Vietnam pullout that did that to him. he had just won one of the biggest landslide elections in history in 72. He had beaten Rockefeller again in 68. And we know the Rockefellers are very much at the top of the food chain when it comes to these multinational corporations and organizations. I've always thought the same thing. Interesting thing about Nixon is the guy who led the Watergate break-in, and I'm just now drawing a blank on his name, was also in, I'll get it in a second here, I'll look it up, was also in Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. It was also in Dallas on the week that JFK was shot. Same guy, CIA operative. He was one of the Operation Phoenix guys.
Okay, well, let's just talk about that for a second, because that definitely, we know half of the people that were part of the Watergate break-in were Cuban exiles. And that's a nice name to cover up the fact that they were Operation Gladio inside the United States, because that's the same Cuban exiles that blew up former ambassador to Chile, Ambassador Lattier, in the streets of downtown DC. They put a car bomb in his car and it blew up and killed an American and him. They were used multiple times inside the United States for terror acts. They were found in Angola. They were found in Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. They were a deployable cell of terrorists. And those same people, Felix Rodriguez being one of them, which we found in the Iran-Contra. He was the number 3 guy working Iran-Contra underneath of Bush and his national security advisor, Donald Gregg. Donald Gregg hired Felix Rodriguez to run the Iran-Contra from the VP's office. So yeah, dirty, dirty, dirty.
E. Howard Hunt is a gentleman's name who led the Watergate break-in, and he was the CIA leader at the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah. And so like you said, he shows up over in Vietnam.
Yep. He's one of those people who's been in a lot of interesting places at some interesting times.
He's been present on just about every Operation Gladio for about a 30-year period of time.
Yeah, he's like the Forrest Gump of intelligence.
That's hilarious. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, E. Howard Hunt confessed to all this on his deathbed.
Yes.
So
absolutely. Okay, so we've got Jimmy Carter's role in it, and you've already covered the fact that Agha Hassan Abedi was the founder in 1972. And I love his bleeding heart story about how he wanted to just help the poor people of the third world. Excuse me, that was the story that kept getting told over and over again about what a great bank BCCI was, because it was going to afford all of the third world countries. And yet the primary victim of BCCI was third world countries and the people that had accounts. Every time they closed down one of them for fraud, they lost all of their money. So
yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking to myself, how we know today that Pakistan is a CIA and Pentagon hotspot. All of the Pakistani generals train over here in America with the Pentagon. We've had a lot of control over their foreign policy and their government for quite some time. That's why there was a color revolution that ousted Khan. Is it Imran Khan?
Khan was just ousted, but we had Boutro before that. We've assassinated several of their prime ministers that we don't like.
Well, it brings up one of the early origins that ran through Pakistan is when we were funding the arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that was going through Pakistan and BCCI. So the CIA was working with them all the way back then. That's documented. But my question, I guess, really is, when did Pakistan really become a U.S. intelligence asset? How far back?
Day one. Well, Pakistan, and I've done a lot of research on this particular subject, so thank you for setting that up. Unplanned. In the post-World War II, you can look at every single created out of whole cloth country, Pakistan being one of them. Pakistan didn't exist until post-World War II. Taiwan
carved out of India, right?
And partly out of Afghanistan. So they basically just took and carved this up. But did you also know, because I didn't know this, and shame on me for not knowing this, did you know that there was at post-World War II, a West Pakistan, which is what we know as Pakistan today, but they had set up an East Pakistan to basically sandwich India in between two hostile forces. Because if you understand why we fought World War II, which was to create the strategy of tension afterwards in order to allow these military industrial complex conflicts to create all of the chaos all over the world, to include Israel, Pakistan, Taiwan. Every hotspot that we have today was created post-World War II and has been used since then to instigate a perpetual war machine in order to control all of us and steal our wealth. That's the premise of Operation Gladio in a nutshell. And so then you have to go back and look at where they all are. So in Pakistan, they created West Pakistan, but there's this tiny little thing on the east side of India that they also called Pakistan, which sandwiched India in between of it. And do you know what East Pakistan is now today?
If you tell me it's Azerbaijan, is it Bangladesh?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating you bring that up because we've been talking for the last few weeks. We need to do a sit rep on the recent color revolution in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of the above. And if you look at a map, they were all surrounding India. One of my research buddies, Ethan, shout out to you, buddy. He's been feeding me a lot of information and Azerbaijan and stuff like that, articles. So he's done a lot of the deep digging on this. But he's got a theory that they're doing that to surround India. Why? Why is Modi in so much trouble? Well, he's meeting with Putin, and he's basically not going along
You're
with
not
the
allowed to do that.
So I found a fascinating blurb the other day. Let me just pull that up real quick. Come on, I got it right here. Out of the blue, this is from last week. India recalls its high commissioner and other diplomats from Canada. Canadian police accuse the Indian government of criminal activity in the country. It says the Indian government is conducting illegal intelligence gathering activities in Canada through agents and is involved in murders and violence, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Commissioner Mike Durham has said. So India is being isolated to some degree from its Western trading partners, etc. It's fascinating from an economic standpoint. If you look around the world, every single country had a post-World War II baby boom, pretty much all of them, where the population exploded. There were only two places where they had what's called an echo boom, because the following generation, I'm Gen X, we're a much smaller generation than the baby boomers. Well, America had an echo boom, which we now call the millennials. The only other major country that had an echo boom was India. Their population will continue to grow. They will surpass China in the next few years. China's population is going to be diminishing because of the one-child policy. It's going to devastate them. This comes at a time when China has been expanding their debt for the last 15 years at a rate even faster than the United States. And you can't have a dwindling population supporting a retiring population with a massive debt problem. It does not work. China does not have the option of immigration because they're the most xenophobic people on the planet. And that is creating an awful lot of geopolitical tensions, is this population ticking time bomb that is going on. So India is something we need to take a really deep look at. They're surrounded by a nuclear adversary.
Yeah. And I think, again, it goes back to the strategy of tension. That is how they manipulate everybody. So I thought you would find that interesting that East Pakistan is now Bangladesh. And of course, they just did a coup there. And by the way, War Hamster, I know everybody in my audience admonished you verbally talking to the screen when you use the word color revolution, because we don't use that word or words, because that's the CIA talking points to get away from the use of the word coup. Because if you actually use the word coup, people look up CIA coup and they'll find 80 of them. If you use color revolution, you only find the ones that they've done since like 2004.
Yeah, 2003 is the first one I have.
Yeah.
And I use that term for anything post 2003, but I will accept my admonishment on your channel.
And understand that that's what they do. They control our words so we can't find our history. And so I have decided to peacefully non-comply with their word manipulation, right? I still use the word gay. I still use the other words that we're not allowed to use. But anyway, it's funny because every time I do a show and I have a guest on and they use the word color revolution, there's like 50 comments. It's not a color revolution, because I have said that like a million times. So I just had to make a joke out of it. In acknowledgement of all of the people that have been listening to me for so long.
Yeah, they're running out of colors, by the way, in the last 20 years. They've had to, call one of them the Maidon Revolution, and now they don't even use the term anymore. I think they just ran out of colors on the spectrum. The first one, of course, being the Rose Revolution, which is how we got involved in Ukraine in the first place, but that's not this show.
I just got a link that says they're having trouble on the Twitter end of our stream. I was just broadcasting it live over there, and for some reason they're having a problem with it. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what that is all about, but anyway, okay, we probably need to, I obviously we could talk about this for days, but I did want to, at least in this initial session, get to let's see, the rest of the founding that I had, and that was Clifford, the attorney / president / chairman, Clark Clifford, ends up talking to Senator Claiborne Peel. And Claiborne Peel, who's a Democrat, is in charge of the Foreign Relations Committee during this time. And I did want to bring up real quick this guy, because it's fascinating. Hold on, let me find where he's at. Claiborne Peel. Thought I had him already open, but I don't see him on here. All right, here he is.
I've never heard of this guy, so I'm all here.
All right, well, this is very interesting because I want to tell you who his stepdad is. So Claiborne Peel was born in 1918. So he's an old guy. He is a descendant from Senator William Claiborne, and he has one of those very similar, like going back to the 1600s kind of northeastern pedigree. And he was born in New York City. He was a senator from Rhode Island, which of course we know that's where Newport, all the moneyed people are at. His parents divorced early, and his mother remarried a guy by the name of Hugo Kohler, Koehler. Now, if you pull him up, now this is the guy that raised Peel. He was a U.S. Navy commander and secret agent, as well as a socialite. So following World War I, he served as the Office of Naval Intelligence and also served in the State Department as an operative. So he's basically like the pre-OSS guy. He was in Russia during its Civil War. He later served as a naval attaché to Poland. And there was a rumor that he was the illegitimate son of the Crown Prince of Austria. So he has a very interesting background on all of his, and I mean, he was part of the, Kohler's grandfather was part of the Hesh in Germany. And I mean, that guy goes back. So this is the guy that raises Peel.
I just pulled him up, and I'm reading a blurb that says, is revealed to be the Archduke Jonathan Salvator of Austria, son of Leopold II, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and a member of the Imperial Austrian Habsburg family.
Yes.
You could talk about Northeastern blue bloods. That's going all the way back to royal family type stuff.
Yes. So this is the guy that Clifford uses inside of the Senate. And you also see that Peel ends up, he's in oil. He is going back to his actual real father, who ends up being a ambassador to Portugal and Hungary. And so this guy has got like international syndicate written all over him, right? So I like doing the research to put into context, just like you do. Whenever these people use people to their agenda, you have to always look into those people. So it was Peel that granted BCCI the 30-day delay in subpoena information, so that all of the BCCI information came into the Senate after the investigator left. After Bloom was gone and his contract expired, all of BCCI information came into the Senate because of Peel.
Some fascinating connections.
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, thank you. That rabbit trail is brand new to me, so I'm going to be having I'm going to have some fun on that one.
And as you mentioned earlier, the fact that they got fined $14 million as a result of that investigation was nothing. But then you have to, like you say, bring that to current day. Talk to us a little bit about the TD money laundering fine that just happened.
Well, I can tell you a lot about that because I'm indirectly, I'm actually given a deposition to U.S. attorneys on a case that's related to it. But TD Bank was basically a giant money laundering bank. And the way modern money laundering works is you take dirty money and you try to funnel it into this country through whatever bank. And you try to invest it in a legitimate business, whether it be real estate, anything else operating. But you have to do it through someone who's clean, friends and family. So that's how they wash their hands of it. It comes out the other end clean. They usually do this with shell companies or silent partners. There's all kinds of tax fraud that goes along with it because you're distributing income as quite often they do it as a 1099 contractor, although you have no contract, and where it should be being distributed as a qualified dividend. The fascinating thing about this TD Bank is they're getting fined about $1.9 billion, which sounds like a whole heck of a lot of money. If you go back to 2008, the presidential election was Obama versus McCain. And I remember this vividly because I was working for a Wall Street bank at the time, Citibank. And Obama was going about, it's almost exactly 16 years ago to the day. It was like 16 years ago last week. Obama's trailing by a few points in the polls to McCain on a Thursday, Friday. And all of a sudden that Friday after market close, Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt over that weekend. Obama halts his campaign efforts and flies back into Wall Street and meets with all the banks. He wakes up Monday morning and he's about 5 points ahead in the polls. My conjecture has always been a deal was cut. You'll notice that once Obama did win the election, they had an awful lot of evidence of against the banks. What happened is, first of all, the banks, no major banker above a certain rank went to jail, period. The Bank of International Settlements even came into America's court system and said, you can't prosecute these people. We're going to claim these records as our own. And as we know, the Bank of International Settlements has complete immunity in every single country where they operate. You can't even subpoena their records. They're not subject to immigration rules if you work for a Bank of International Settlements. So that's why we got no justice there. But the interesting part is all these millions and billions of dollars of fines the banks paid did not go back into the Treasury coffers. They are redistributed to certain favored NGOs and charities that the administration wants them to go to. That is how we're funding, a big part of how we're funding the U.S. government is all of these quasi-government agencies who do all the dirty work that the government can't do for themselves. It's the exact same scheme domestically that the USAID uses internationally.
Correct. And that slush fund is used, as you say, into the NGOs. And we know that and I've done several, the American Security Council. I mean, you can go down the list of the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation are used as CIA cutouts to move money around in order to fund whether it's the initiatives of the National Endowment for Democracy, the USAID, all being I refer to them all as CIA fronts because they are working an agenda that is in concert with what the CIA wants to do, either in overthrowing governments or creating the strategy of tension or whatever.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about it is they hide it behind what's called a tax-free foundation, where you put your generational wealth inside of this tax shelter, and 100 years later, it's still not being taxed, yet you're getting all the benefits from it. You can be the head of a tax-free foundation and draw a salary of about 5% of assets for the rest of your life. That's annually, every single year. That's the drawdown you'll see with like a charitable foundation. It's usually in the 5% ballpark, and I think it's statutory limited to 5%. But if you're talking about $1 billion foundation, just back of the napkin math, that's living off $50 million a year, and it's pretty much guaranteed. They don't have a whole lot of financial worries, the beneficiaries of these foundations, and they absolutely are the ones who sit at the head of the table that are determining who becomes our Secretary of State, who becomes the head of the CIA, who are going to be the ambassadors. Why are the ambassadors always big campaign donors? Well, there you have it. They want to buy that political power and prestige.
And I've come to realize when I've been doing this research is when you go back into the history of who these people are, I always like to look at what they did then and who they're doing it with now. So I was dumbfounded at the number of rags to riches stories. Some guy buys a little sailboat off the coast of New Jersey and ferries people over to New York. And 3 years later, he's got an entire fleet and he's a shipping magnate. I don't believe those stories. Just like I don't believe Zuckerberg created Facebook in his garage. And because I don't believe those things, I compare those rags to riches stories with the current ones. And I say kind of in a tongue-in-cheek manner, oh my God, look, we found another rag to riches guy. And in doing that, it almost appears to me, and this is complete speculation on my part, that there are people, and almost every one of them come, even back in the 1930s, came from divorced parents or a parent where one had died. Some traumatic effect of a child from that circumstance, and they strike it rich, blah, blah, blah. And so when you start noticing these patterns, all of them end up with a foundation. And it makes me question whether or not these foundations were a requirement. And so now I move forward to BCCI and I look at and I say, remember when we overthrew all of these governments and we installed a dictator, did we require them all to set up an account at BCCI so that we made that money laundering capability? If you look at the, as you pointed out, the generational wealth in these foundations, if these people were basically used as these heads of companies and said, you can live off of the proceeds of the foundation, but we are going to use the foundation. You are going to have, you're going to sell your soul to the Satan, but you're going to set your family up forever in a life of luxury by doing that. And oh, by the way, that money that you're sitting on, we are going to use for nefarious things. And we're going to put all of our people on the foundational boards, which if you go back and you look at the overlap of the people that are part of the international syndicate and who sits on all of those boards, it's remarkable. It's like a 99% match. And so you have these people in the international syndicate funding, and then you have these CIA people actually doing, and then these CIA people mysteriously end up, because they're all lawyers and kids of doctors and everything else, when they they retire, they end up on the boards of these foundations.
Yeah, and it seems that they all go to the same handful of colleges, and they're all in the same kind of private groups. And it basically it's the blue bloods. There's a historian named Brian McClanahan who describes these people as Yankees, and I love the way he describes it. There's good Yankees, and I'm not just bashing on people from the Northeast. I happen to live in New Hampshire currently, so I'm not. But Yankees, these blue blood people, they were the progressives of the late 1800s. These are the Fabian socialists. These are the Rockefellers. These are the generational wealth that they brought the British class system over to America. And we do have royalty in this country. There are people who are above the law. You know that the son of somebody in even in small town America, if you're the son of whoever the kingmaker of the county is, you get pulled over by the cops, they're going to take you home. They're not going to write you up for DUI. That's always been the case, that we have an extra class of people. And it's not supposed to be that way in America, but it is. There's I've got the book over on the shelf. There's a book called Superclass. And I should remember the guy's name, but he worked for about 2 or 3 decades for, I want to say it was Brzezinski. And basically he talked about the ruling families of the world. And he says, basically you got about 6,000 ruling families around the world. They're not all in America. They're not all in Europe. These are the players, and they will send their representatives to the United Nations to cut those deals. But it's pretty fascinating. This guy is a deep stater himself, obviously a 1970s liberal, but he actually told a lot of truths in that book. Should remember his name. My apologies. I'll have it ready for us next show.
Okay, and so probably in closing, I just want to finish this line. Florida does end up shutting down BCCI branches and made them liquidate all of their interest in the other Florida banks. They were not allowed to bank in Florida anymore. And Awan was found guilty of money laundering, but no one in the DOJ, the IRS, or anybody else asked him any follow-on questions. And that's kind of my segue back to the TD story, is they have a money laundering story of, if their fine is $2 billion, the amount of money they laundered is probably in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think they even talked about what they actually made in the indictment on the money laundering, and it isn't even a drop in the bucket compared to what they made. So this is not even a slap on the wrist. This is maybe stubbing their toe. And nowhere, just as in BCCI, is there indictments on who generated the money to be laundered. I cannot tell you how pissed off I get that this is like charging the hooker for having sex and not the Johns, right? That's kind of the analogy when you hold a bank responsible for money laundering, but not the creators of the money being laundered and using illicit activity crimes to generate the money.
They'll get some of the downstream operators, but there will be a limit to how far it goes, just like with BCCI. There would be a limit to how high up the food chain they're allowed to investigate. But the funny part is, okay, you've got the FBI, you've got the IRS, and you've got Treasury doing these investigations. You basically have the government investigating three branches of the government investigating one of its other branches, because we know the CIA is at the heart of a lot, or at least connected. Some of this, some of the money laundering is just, probably 100% pure organized crime, but you're never 100% pure organized crime. There's always an intelligence aspect to it as well. So we have the government investigating itself. I wonder how that's going to turn out.
The same way. Well, and that kind of segues into the criticalness of this election, because potentially if Trump is elected, it turns out completely different than it ever has in the past.
Yeah, well, that's why you're going to see the biggest temper tantrum in the history of mankind on November the 6th if Trump pulls this off. I track all the polls and the betting markets on a weekly basis, and I have never seen a gap in the betting markets happen like it has in the past week as Trump is pulling away. He's now up by like 16 points in the betting markets. Crossing my fingers, because we know that the elections are not quite as, shall we say, predictable as they ought to be. But it's starting to look good.
But I had dinner with Brian Cates last night, and his mantra, which you can't find fault in it. It's too big to cheat. The margin at 16% is too big to cheat.
Yeah, who is it? Seth Keshel estimates that the most they can do is manufacture 3%, maybe as much as 5% in any given state. But it is that I've worked a lot with a lot of election integrity groups around the country. One of my tech guys, we were trying to float. We have an ability to create a database of every voter registration in America. We weren't able to raise the capital for that project in time, so we didn't launch it this time. But I've spoken to a lot of these groups. Compared to 2020, we have a lot more eyes on the prize. We know a lot more about how elections are manipulated. We've had groups all over the country cleaning voter rolls, and that really matters. When Biden issued Executive Order 14019 in 2021, that basically mandated that every single government agency start registering voters. And that's not what the government's supposed to do. But the question I've been asking on air and off for more than 3 years, who's the Department of Health and Human Services or the DHS? Who are they registering to vote? Who's the FBI registering to vote? Every single government agency had to be involved in voter registration. So we know the voter rolls are where any kind of manipulation is going to start, but we've done a much better job than we did in 2020. It's going to be not as good as it could have been. A lot of states tightened up some of their voter rolls. There's only going to be half the amount of mail-in votes. So it is going to be a lot harder to manipulate a total. I'm not going to get into the electronic machines. That's someone else's bailiwick, but I do think we have a pretty good chance of getting a much more fair election than we did in 2020 with less shenanigans.
I agree. Okay. Do you have any closing comments?
No. I'm going to post this video 24 hours later. I'll let it run on your channel for now. You can find this and my other stuff on go to Rumble and just type in war_hamster. Right down here on the screen is my Twitter, or I should say X account is at war_hamster1776. And you can also get me on True Social at war_hamster.
And if you guys are not following him, you are really missing out. Definitely need to follow him. My go-to guy on anything that's banking, finance. And that's why I thought, because BCCI kind of cuts the baby in half here between the banking and the international syndicate / Operation Gladio, that this was a perfect topic. And we are going to try to do this at a regularly scheduled time for the next couple of Thursdays so that we can get this story out. Because as you saw today, the relevance to what's going on today is in every step of it, whether it's the corruption in the DOJ, the corruption in the FBI, the CIA's involvement, the banking, money laundering, the fact that we're talking about Pakistan. And I did want to go back and just kind of cross that T. I don't think I finished my thought on the fact that Pakistan, being created after World War II, was 100% a manipulated state that was ran by the CIA. The intelligence agency, in setting up the ISI inside of Pakistan and our fully funding basically the entire state of Pakistan. UK did it a little bit, but that was kind of, the UK was behind India. We were behind Pakistan, kind of shell game that they played in making sure that they created enough turmoil between them with Operation Gladio style chaos along their borders, all orchestrated, that justified the creation of nuclear capability on both sides. Well, what that gave the CIA is nuclear capability because they basically own Pakistan and always have. It was not coincidental that that's where bin Laden was hanging out. And if you think about that for 2 seconds, the CIA basically owns the ISI. They trained them, as you pointed out. All of the Pakistani generals were trained by the U.S. military. And so it ought to be very odd that bin Laden was right under everybody's noses if you actually think about it for 2 seconds. But of course, they use the ISI, as you said. We've talked about it. We talked about Afghanistan and the fact that there was this fake communist movement inside of Afghanistan. We overthrew the royal family in Afghanistan in a coup. We baited the Russians into, we being the CIA, baited the Russians into Afghanistan and attacking them by sending a whole bunch of false information saying that there's this little wanting cell of communists in there and they need help. And we actually sent Mujahideen up to pick a fight with them. So there was just all kinds of operations that were done, and they were largely done using Pakistan. So the fact that BCCI mysteriously appears in Pakistan is not coincidental.
Very good. If anybody wants to prep before our next show, there's a mini series on Amazon Prime called The Mafia and Banks. It's 3 1-hour skips. It gives you more background information on that at a high level. It is definitely worth the 3 hours if you want to give your money to Jeff Bezos. But no, it is actually worth watching. So that'll be a good primer. I'll be bringing some of that information when we get together next week.
Awesome. All right. We're going to call it today. Thank you,
Sure.
Brady, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
See you guys later. See you next week.